Chapter 2, Genesis from 30,000 feet. Now that we have established that Genesis is an ancient story, let's take a brief tour of where we are headed. The book of Genesis is 50 chapters long. It takes us from Adam to Joseph, from the creation of the cosmos to Israel's entrance into Egypt. These 50 chapters of Genesis are often divided into two main sections: Genesis chapters 1 through 11 and Genesis chapters 12 through 50. But before we go any further, we have a confession to make. If we were truly reading Genesis through ancient eyes, we would have to get rid of chapters altogether. The ancient Israelites didn't have chapters or verse numbers. Centuries later, Christian monks added them to help readers find their way through the Bible. And we are most grateful to these blessed monks. Imagine trying to find a passage without chapter and verse numbers. But the Bible did not start out that way. Instead of chapters, Genesis introduces new sections with a phrase variously translated in English as, "This is the account of," "These are the descendants of," as in the NRSV, or "These are the generations of." No matter how it's translated, the phrase in Hebrew is exactly the same, and it shows up 10 times in Genesis, thus dividing the book into 10 sections. 6 are found in chapters 1 through 11, and the other 4 in chapters 12 through 50. And here they are. Genesis chapter 2, verse 4. This is the account of the heavens and the earth. Genesis chapter 5, verse 1, line of Adam. Genesis chapter 6, verse 9, line of Noah. Genesis chapter 10, verse 1, line of Noah's sons. Genesis 11, verse 10, line of Shem, one of Noah's sons. Genesis chapter 11, verse 27, line of Terah, Abraham's father. Genesis 25, verse 12, line of Ishmael, Abraham's son by the slave girl Hagar. Genesis chapter 25, verse 19, line of Isaac, Abraham's son by his wife Sarah. Genesis chapter 36, verse 1, line of Esau, Isaac's elder son. Genesis chapter 37, verse 2, line of Jacob, Isaac's younger son, renamed Israel. These 10 sections make a lot of sense if we remember that Genesis is the beginning of Israel's story. Genesis moves us toward Jacob, who will be renamed Israel, and his sons, who will be the patriarchs of the 12 tribes of Israel. If we are going to read Genesis with ancient eyes, we'll need to keep these 10 sections in mind as we move through the 50 chapters we are familiar with. In fact, the chapter and verse divisions the monks gave us sometimes interrupt the flow of the story, making us think there is a break when there isn't. What were those monks thinking? So, even though we will stick with the traditional 50 chapters we have all come to know and love and rely on, we will want to keep in mind that these 10 sections are better guides to the stories we find in Genesis and how they all hang together. They help us remember where the story is heading. Genesis in 571 words. Part 1 of Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, tells the story of the creation of the cosmos, Adam and Eve, the slaying of their son Abel by his older brother Cain, Noah's Ark, and the Tower of Babel. In between are interspersed a family tree and a list of nations after the flood. These 11 chapters are more familiar and more controversial than any others in Genesis. They are also the most misunderstood, which is a big fat shame. Just like the first chapters of your favorite novel, this section sets up some key themes that will show up throughout Genesis, as well as the rest of the Pentateuch. Asking the wrong questions here will lead to major confusion later. Chapters 1 through 11 set us up for the second part of Genesis, chapters 12 through 50, in the same way that movies often have a dramatic opening scene to capture your attention and to give you some background on what's about to happen. One of the best examples is in the movie Up. The opening sequence sets up the entire background for the story in about a minute. Brilliant. Then roll title and credits, followed by the start of the main narrative. Genesis, chapters 1 through 11, is the opening sequence that grabs your attention and provides the setting for Genesis, chapters 12 through 50, the story of Israel from Abraham to Egypt, from one man to a people, or more specifically, a large clan. They won't become a full-fledged nation or kingdom until after the Israelites leave Egypt and set up shop in Canaan, many centuries later. But every nation has humble beginnings, and Israel's begin in Genesis chapters 12 through 50. There, we see how a Mesopotamian man, from Babylon no less, named Abraham, called Abram at this point, was chosen by God, without explanation, to leave his homeland and travel to Canaan with his wife, Sarah, or Sarai. Abraham was called by God and promised two things: people and land. Genesis chapters 12 through 50 is a story of Israel's ups and downs and how that roller coaster soap opera will pan out. Where is this dual promise of offspring and land going? Will God come through if Israel keeps behaving badly? Will the patterns of stubbornness and disobedience described in chapters 1 through 11 keep repeating itself? How is God going to handle all this? After we follow the story through Abraham and Isaac, we are introduced to Jacob, Abraham's grandson. Here, amid stories of deceit, plots to murder, and searching for a wife, we find that the promise is alive in this unlikely son. God changes Jacob's name to Israel, which brings the story of Genesis into focus. Israel's 12 sons are ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel, the nation that will occupy center stage for the rest of the Old Testament. The last third of Genesis turns our attention to one of those sons, Joseph. Thrown into a well by his brothers, he winds up in Egypt with near supreme power. After some on-the-edge-of-your-seat family drama that DreamWorks happily cashed in on, Genesis ends with Jacob's death and all 12 sons and their families in Egypt. Of course, this is the perfect setup for the sequel, which we find in the famous story of the Exodus. Another story DreamWorks happily cashed in on, though we still prefer our Moses looking like Charlton Heston instead of one of the Backstreet Boys. A self-centered story. And that is the SparkNotes version of Genesis that will hopefully help as we get further and further into the details of the story. But before we do, we want to point out a few landmarks that will help to remind us that we're on the right path. If this really is a story about Israel, edited by Israelites returned from exile and wondering about their relationship to God, we should expect to see that in the story, and we do. Genesis is all about Israel as recipient of God's promise of people and land. Keeping our eyes open to Genesis, trying to read it as an ancient Israelite would, we may be surprised at how often the themes of land and people show up. Actually, we will see the struggle between Israel and God over land and people. We find ourselves reading about some struggle at every point in the story. Creation, we'll explain in the next chapter. Adam, Cain, Noah, and Abraham and his offsprings, siblings especially, seem to struggle a lot. And if we need more convincing that struggling is a big issue in Genesis, look at Jacob. He literally wrestles with God, and his new name, Israel, we are told in Genesis chapter 32, verse 28, reflects how Jacob had struggled with God and with humans and prevailed. Israel comes from a word that means to struggle. This is exactly what we would expect from a story written by exiled Israelites who are struggling with their current conditions and ultimately their very identity. And lastly, we should find evidence that these stories are trying to connect an exiled audience with their ancient past. These Israelites were not interested in reading about Noah and the flood because it's a great story or because it has a great principle to live by. And they weren't interested in trying to find out what really happened, as a modern historian might. They were writing and reading these stories to understand their own relationship with God. We will find several places where these stories tell us a lot about how later Israelites saw themselves. God's relationship with Israel, people, land, struggle, all from a later point of view. This is the story of Genesis.